Last time I left off talking about these three revolutions that were produced by Enlightenment thinking. Of course, the Enlightenment being based on intellectual independence. And there could be some critique of the Enlightenment thinking because is pure reason, as they claim to have everybody claim to be operating by the principles of reasoning and thinking for oneself. But that didn't mean everybody agreed, or is that enough without an authority to establish truth? Well, these three revolutions were produced, most famous probably being the American Revolution, more for liberty, and then the French Revolution being more based around the idea of forced equality by the state, the new state taking over. In terms of philosophy, the next philosophers to view are Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and they're differing philosophies. Hobbes writes a famous book called the Leviathan, which is named after a creature in the Bible, but it's more this idea of this large thing, and he's using it more at the idea of the large political state and oneness, the monopoly of a single political state. And he viewed it as being concentrated more so in a king than just a general government. But Thomas Hobbes writes Leviathan, and he's famous for his distrust and low view of human nature, somewhat appropriately. But let's look at some of the things he writes. So he believes in the state of nature. So in these political philosophers, a lot of them during this time would go back to this idea of, before governments are formed, what was the state in terms of what was the environment like, in terms of just the state of pure nature? Was there this time? Now, I think you can even debate about, did this time as they're describing it even really exist? Because they're just saying, okay, well, before governments came around, we were in this state of nature and here's what it was like. But they don't point to any historical evidence. They don't point to any real evidence at all. It's all just theory. I mean, so who's to say it was that way? They go off of kind of what humans are like in their time and work backwards in their theory and their philosophy. So, but his idea is that the state of nature of humans is violence and war. Now, this has a lot of truth to it, but we'll also see kind of a critique of this. He says that men are, he means mankind in general, men, women, in general, are fairly equal in the sense of that they have this equality of ability to try to achieve their ends, to try to achieve their goals, and that causes conflict. Now, there's a lot of truth in that people have imperfect human nature, they have fallen human nature, they have desires, they have this strength to accomplish their desires, and sometimes they want things at cross purposes with one another that leads to conflict. He writes, "From this equality of ability ariseth equality of hope of attaining our ends. And therefore, if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies. And in the way to their end, endeavor to destroy or subdue one another." So he's saying, look, two people who both want to achieve one thing and they both can't have it, they both want it, that makes them now enemies, and now they have to decide if they want to be master or slave. They have to destroy their enemy or force them into subservience in order to get what they want. That's somewhat true, but there could also be peaceful ways of arguably doing that, through prices, through freedom of association, through markets. But you can see where his theory is coming from. It makes some sense. If two people want something and can't both have it, they might fight to get it instead of figuring out a peaceful solution. So that's what he is afraid of, and that's where it's going to lead to his argument for government. He says, "For war consisteth not in battle only, or the act of fighting, but in the tract of time, wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. Meaning, war is not just in the actual battle itself, but in the propensity, the tendency toward fighting one another. While we know that's there, he says that there must always be this state of war. While we know that that's in us and in other people, we're always in a state of war as long as that human nature exists. He says, and therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war, so that the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. During all the time, there is no assurance to the contrary. Meaning, if there's no guarantee that there won't be the possibility of fighting from other human beings for resources, for what we want, for goals, then that time period is called war. If there's the absence of that, that's called peace. Okay, so his fear is fear of war. Okay, that the human nature is one of war. He says, now this is what drives people to peace instead of war. This is going to figure into his argument of government. He says, the passions that incline men to peace are fear of death, desires for such things necessary for commodious living, and a hope by their industry to obtain them. So he says, look, we have these natural inclinations that are going to drive us away from war to peace, but they're not enough. He says, we fear death, so that may help us avoid fighting each other in war because we may die. We want to live a better life, a more comfortable life, a more commodious life, a life that is that can be advanced by wealth, and the ability to earn that wealth and to accomplish those goals. He says those are the things that will lead to peace. He says those are in humans to lead to peace, but it's not enough, because if you think that other humans are going to fight with you, just because you desire those things won't be enough for you to get out of the mindset of war. He talks about security. He says, wherein men live without security, then what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. So one of his cases for government is going to be this lack of security, that if the only security we can have is what we can provide and how much we can defend ourselves through physical strength or through mental acuity, then we're in a pretty vulnerable situation if we are not the strongest mentally or physically or both. He says, and because the condition of man is a condition of war, and everyone against everyone, there is nothing he can make use of that may not help him unto the preserving of his life against his enemies. It followeth that in such a condition every man has the right to everything, even to another's body. And therefore, as long as this is the natural right of every man to everything endureth, there can be no security to any man. Now, what he's arguing is that if your right to survival is above everything, and you can use anything for your security, then you can even kill people, enslave people, do whatever it is you have to do that you see as in your need to survive. And he says, but while we're in that condition, there is no security, because someone could always be stronger. And so it's a war of every man against every man, and that there's no security for anyone in that position. He says, covenants without the sword are but words, meaning you make a promise or a contract but aren't able to back it up with violence, then they are meaningless and of no strength to secure a man at all. Therefore, notwithstanding the laws of nature, if there be no power erected or not great enough for our security, every man will rely on his own strength and art for caution against all other men. Seeing some typos here, but he says that without a sword of enforcement to back it up, covenants, contracts are meaningless. And there is some truth to that. There has to be some enforcement mechanism, but that's not necessarily the case that they're totally void, because people make promises without the threat of force all the time. And contract could be enforced, and covenant could be enforced, but that doesn't necessarily justify the modern political state in what we know it as today from that argument. So his idea of government, he says, one person of whose acts a great multitude by mutual covenants with one another have made themselves every one the author, to the end that he may use strength and means of them all, as he shall think expedient for their peace and common defense. So he's saying basically, since this would be a bad position to live in as individuals, without this security, without this peace, in this natural war against each other when we desire better things but aren't able to accomplish them, he says that one person would have to or government would kind of have to rule over all, and it would be kind of all of us would agree together to follow it because we would see better results under that type of system. He says the final cause, end, or design of men who naturally love liberty and dominion over others in the introduction of that restraint upon themselves in which we see them live in commonwealths is the foresight of their own preservation and a more contented life thereby. So he says, okay, here's what's true about human beings, and here's why they form governments. He says human beings naturally love liberty, freedom to do whatever they want, absolutely freedom, not just freedom to do what's within our rights, but freedom to do absolutely anything. And he says, and they also love dominion over others. Okay, so the freedom includes dominating others by power, force, or cunning, by outsmarting people. He says, since those are the realities, he says, people agree together to live in commonwealths under a government for their own self-preservation. And there's a lot of truth in that. But the question is, and this helps to kind of refine political philosophy, is if human nature is so bad, which it arguably is, humans can do terrible things to each other, but who runs the government? It's not non-humans. Those humans with the same human nature are also in charge of government. And now they have this aspect of authority and responsibility and power and force against others that's legitimized in a way that just one-to-one human violence or group-to-one human violence is not. And so eventually, if this philosophy was followed consistently, it would have to lead to one world government where there's only one government ruling them all. Because if two people can fight each other, then two governments can fight each other, that one government must rule them all. In Hobbes's thinking, at least if we follow it through consistently with the logic that he uses and with the assumptions that he uses. So the problem is, and a question all people should ask themselves, is which concerns them more? Which do they fear more? People without the restraint of government, human nature without the restraint of government, or human nature in charge of the apparatus of government power. You have to have human nature involved either way. So you either have human nature on the individual and group level, or human nature in charge of government. Now, which one is preferable? That is the question that will help define your political philosophy. So he says, for if we could suppose a great multitude of men to consent in the observation of justice and other laws of nature without a common power to keep them in awe, we might well suppose that all mankind would do the same. And then there neither would be nor need to be civil government or a commonwealth at all, because there would be peace without subjection. Now, what he points out here is actually a very key point. He says, if we could expect and we could trust our fellow human beings to observe natural laws and the laws of justice. Don't harm people, don't murder people, don't steal people's stuff, don't physically aggress against people, don't rape people, don't kidnap people, don't enslave people. If we could expect a majority of people, Hobbes says, to follow that code of natural law, then maybe we wouldn't need a government because most people would just follow the laws of justice. But he says, but human nature is not that way. And he brings up a good point. Could people be expected to follow that? And he says, and with that, you wouldn't need a civil government or a commonwealth. He says, because there would be peace without that need for threat of subjection. But here's the problem with that. It's the same problem I mentioned earlier. That common power to keep people in awe can also be corrupted because it is run by humans with the same violent human nature that Hobbes describes. So we have to be careful when we say what the role of government should be, because government is run by imperfect humans who, if we fear imperfect humans in general without government, we ought also to fear humans who are in charge of government, using power and subjection against other people. He says, if that could be the case, government wouldn't be necessary. Now, if he's arguing that government is necessary, I think there's a little bit of an inconsistency in the sense that he's still expecting government to be ruled over by humans, who humans can do bad things from government just as much as they can do bad things as individuals. And so I agree that some form of subjection is necessary to prevent that going against natural law and going against laws of basic justice, murder, theft. But you have to be careful with what that role of the government is, because otherwise a government could just be a criminal gang of humans using the powers that they've been able to accumulate in order to subjugate others to do their will under the name of government. So this is the cover piece to his book, Leviathan. That the idea, and if you can't really see it very well probably, but this king, that's in the picture, is made up of the people. That the idea is we are all the government, that the government is this entity to overawe all of us, but we're all a part of it because of that idea of we have no one ever documented it or figured it out, but we all at one time agreed to be a part of this. But the problem is there's no historical record of that. There's no real consent where people were asked whether or not they consent to this system. But he says that it happened long ago in this theoretical state of nature. He's also arguing in defense of Charles I, the King of England, who was beheaded by the Puritans. Hobbes wrote this book, Leviathan, while he was on the run, and he wrote it against the idea of regicide, of killing the king. So Charles I of England had been killed by the Puritans, had been beheaded for not observing a more republican form of government that was more responsive to the more elected group. And so they reigned for a while without a king, and then eventually Charles II returns, and that Puritan reign under Oliver Cromwell is over. And next time we'll get on to John Locke, who's more familiar and more of an influencer of American political thought, that American political thought leans closer to Locke than Hobbes. And Locke is also an influencer of Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence.